everybody, my name is Terry, and you will know if you watched my compression test video that I had a very disappointing result with number 1 cylinder. Let's look back on that. Absolutely nothing at all. We know that the valve clearances are correct, we know there isn't a hole in the piston. Therefore, we need to get in and take the engine out and take a look at the valves. If you have never taken the engine out in one of these before, I do have a video on that and also another video of how to put it back in. I will link to those in the description, but assuming that you've seen those, let's get on with it and let's get at these valves. So first job is off with the cam cover, 8 bolts, easy. And the cam cover has a one-piece rubber gasket that's quite long. If that's in good condition, you can reuse it. They're not too expensive. You want to order a new one. And they've got 4 metal inserts, that are little round things that go towards the edges. You need to keep those. Now, as I go through the process of stripping down the head, from time to time I'll put excerpts from the manual up here so that you can cross-refer from what's in the manual to what I'm doing. So the first thing here is I'm going at this oil line, which is this rather curious bridge-shaped thing here. Underneath here is an oil pipe. Once that's removed, we remove the cam chain guide, which is this little sort of igloo-shaped thing, the way that you're looking at it, or a sideways C perhaps. There are 2 black plastic oil pool caps here and here. Just pull them off with your hands. And now we remove the 4 camshaft holders which are closest to the cam chains. Each one has 2 bolts. These all have small steel dowels through which the bolts go, and they can hold the camshaft holder pretty tight onto the head there, so sometimes you need to give it a really good wiggle to try and get it off. This particular dowel really didn't want to come out, so I used a pair of grips to just get a good hold on it and twist it out. Now, disassembly is a lot easier if you can loosen the cam chain. So we're going to start with the top one, the one that goes horizontally between the exhaust and the inlet cam. There is a bolt at the front here and a small lock nut at the base of it. If you undo that and then press down on the bottom of the cam chain and then retighten that nut, it will hold it into place with the chain loosened. The thing to remember here is that what this bolt does is it locks the tensioner in one particular position. It doesn't make the tensioner go tighter or looser, it just locks it wherever it is. It's self-adjusting. So you can see here I'm using a wrench to push down against the spring and then just tighten the bolt up, and then I'll go and tighten the lock nut up as well so it doesn't move. That will loosen the chain and just make it easy to take things apart. There's a similar but slightly different arrangement for the vertical chain that goes around the exhaust cam. Look at the lower bolt of the 2 on the back of the engine here. There's one just above it, but just loosen the lower one and then go to the top of the engine. And we're going to take hold of this bit of metal here with a pair of pliers that's inside this kind of surrounding bracket. Pull it upwards and then tighten the bolt. Next we'll take the timing cover off using the 3 bolts here. This turned into a bit of an epic for me, and all of the bolts stripped. I had to get them all out in different ways. I produced a video for that. Hopefully yours will be easy, but if it isn't, then there's some help for you online. You know where to find. We need to take the stator cover off as well. I actually did this before I removed the engine from the bike, but I'm showing you here for completeness. It's just 3 bolts and it will still be held on by its lead, so you need to just lay it gently down on whatever surface you're working on. With the stator cover off, you'll be able to put a socket onto the crank and rotate the engine, and the aim here is to get it to top dead centre for cylinders number 1 and 4. And you can tell when you've got that because if you look at the timing side, in through this little window here, you'll see the figures 1.4 and T and a data mark, and they should all line up. You'll also see the horizontal grooves at the end of the camshafts will be roughly horizontal, although that's not wildly accurate, but it's a good guide. And importantly, the 4 cam lobes, the pointed bits of the cam lobes on the exhaust and the intake cam, should be pointing inwards towards each other. Now, our next big job is to get the inlet cam off. You've got 4 cam holders left on the inlet cam, and the 2 inner ones are the ones we'll remove first. So just undo the bolts evenly and then wiggle them off. When we take the last two cam holders off, a little bit of care required because the valve springs, which are pretty strong, are pushing up against the cam. And if you loosen one bolt too much, you'll put tension on another and it could potentially snap, and then you're going to have to try and extract it. So just go from one bolt to another, just a few turns at a time, and gradually you'll feel the cam sit up as the springs push it away, and then you can take the holders off. And then if you lift the cam up slightly, you'll be able to slip the chain off the sprocket and pull it out. Before I take the shims out, I'm just going to take a marker pen and number them simply 1 to 8 here, and I'll number the others from 9 to 16 when I do the exhaust cam, just to make sure we put them back in the same place. The shims sit in a small recess on top of the buckets, which in turn sit on top of the valve stems. Now if you just take a small screwdriver, each of those buckets has got a groove set 180 out from each other around its circumference. That allows you to put a little screwdriver in and just lever the shim up and take it out, easy as. Then we'll pull out the buckets themselves. These are quite a tight fit inside their little cylindrical holes, so if there's any resistance it means you're not pulling it straight. I just use needle nose pliers to do this. We'll turn our attention to the exhaust cam now, and the first thing we'll do is the bolt on the sprocket that we can see. There are two 180 out from each other. Well, the one we can see we will loosen, and then we will rotate the engine using the socket on the other side until we can see the other bolt, and then we will undo that and remove it completely. Now be very careful when you do this, because you really do not want to drop the bolt down into the engine and have it rumbling around having a party down by the crankshaft, so just be ever so careful when you take it out. And now in much the same way as we did for the intake cam, we'll take the two cam holders which are closest to the centre of the engine off first, and then we'll do the two outer ones, being careful when we undo the outer ones to do it just 1 or 2 turns at a time so that the pressure comes off the bolts evenly and we don't snap any of them. We can lift the two chains off the sprockets now and pull the whole arrangement out. As we do that, then the top cam chain will come away completely. We can just put it to one side. The one that goes over the exhaust cam sprocket, we do need to make sure that that doesn't drop down into the other end of it, which is down in the crankcase. So let's put something between that. I'll put a screwdriver there for now, and then I'm going to wrap it with a zip tie a little bit later so there's no chance of it dropping down. Then we'll number the shims and pull them out just as we did on the intake side and remove the buckets. And that's the head almost completely disassembled and ready to be removed from the engine. Before removing the head, we've got to take off this oil line. It's got a banjo bolt on top here and the bottom. It should be quite stiff. The manual then requires that you remove the two cam chain tensioner bolts at the back of the engine. On reflection, I'm not quite sure whether this was necessary because they stay on the lower part of the engine, they don't come off of the head. No doubt about this though, at the front of the engine there's the cam chain housing, and that's got 2 bolts, and you definitely need to remove those, otherwise the head won't come off. The head itself is secured by 12 bolts. There's quite some tension on this, and we'll just release that in a sort of a crisscross fashion. We'll be a bit more scientific about this when we put it back on and torque it down. Just be aware that the 4 bolts that are closest to the void that goes down into the crankcase can be tricky. As you'll see, I actually drop a nut down towards the crankcase here and have to use a magnet to retrieve it. The 12 nuts that we've removed are sitting atop these long studs that you can just see poking out from the top of the cylinder head. And now we'll take the cylinder head off, and of course all of these studs are in parallel, and you've got to take it off exactly straight, otherwise you'll feel resistance. So we'll gently wiggle it, no need to whack it with a hammer or anything daft like that. And if you put something to use as a shim or a wedge, I'm just using a little bit of wood down on one side and then lift the other, that can help you to get it off evenly. Also be careful about that cam chain, you don't want that to drop down into the crankcase. So with a little bit of gentle wiggling, you'll soon be able to ease everything up and off. Now with the head off, you can see that there's a steel dowel, one on either side, and obviously that's going to be quite stiff in there, so I'm just using a pair of mole grips. One of them remained in the engine, one of them remained in the head. We're just going to pull them out and put them to one side for safekeeping. I've used a cable tie to stop the cam chain dropping down into the crankcase, and here I'm just moving it out of the way so that I can remove the cylinder head gasket. Now these are really expensive items, and obviously every time you tighten the head down you will need a new one, so best to get that ordered nice and early. Now before I go to the valves, I'm going to clean things up a little bit. You can see that the piston crowns have got carbon deposits on them, and if we look inside the head itself you can see that the valves are pretty carbon infested too, so let's get in there with a brass brush and some carb cleaner. As you move from one piston to another, you'll need to rotate the engine using the socket or a spanner and just gently feed the cam chain round as well to bring another piston crown to the surface so you can get at it to clean it. After you clean each piston, rotate the engine again until the piston crown is at the bottom of its travel, and clean up and then have a really good look at the inside of the barrel. And what we're looking for here is any signs of damage, scores or scratching, because that too could mean that you would lose compression. Here, number one cylinder, which is the one I'm concerned about, it looks absolutely perfect. And now with everything as clean as I'm prepared to get it, let's go in now and remove some valves. There are 4 valves in each cylinder, but for simplicity I'm going to draw it as though it were one so that we can just demonstrate the principles. Each valve goes through a metal guide, and this normally has a bit of rubber on top to act as an oil seal. On top of each valve and over the guide sits a spring. Well, actually 2 springs, but I'm just drawing one to keep it simple. And on top of the spring goes a retainer, which looks a little bit like a flattened top hat. In order to keep the spring in place, we compress it, and then we put these 2 semicircular things in the top here. They're called collets. The Americans call them valve keepers, which is a much more descriptive name. When we fit the valves, we release the spring tension, and this allows the retainer to go over the 2 collets or valve keepers, and it holds everything firmly in place. You'll need to get yourself a valve spring compressor tool. This one was 22 quid on eBay. The way this works is you place this bit over the head of the valve, you place this bit over the stem of the valve where the retainers are, and then with the handle you press it together to compress the spring, and it geometrically locks itself. Now if it's too tight or if it's too slack, then you can just turn this adjuster here. So the plan is to take all 4 valves out of number 1 cylinder, and that's what I'm going at here with the tool. And I've already taken one of the exhaust valves out of number 4 cylinder. You can see that in the magnetic tray, and that's because the exhaust valves are quite often burnt, but it's not always obvious whether something's sort of burnt beyond a reasonable point or not, so this provides a point of reference. So I've put the tool over the exhaust valve, I've closed the handle, and now I'm going in with a magnet and a pick just to pull those valve collets or retainers away. Because the retaining cap is pressed down by the tool, they're easy to access now, and they're magnetic, and then you can see it there, comes out easy as pie. So we'll take both of those out, and when we do that we'll just open the tool, and then we'll be able to remove the valve by hand. You'll notice when it comes out that we've got the valve retainer cap followed by the 2 springs that sit over the valve stem, and then once they're out of the way, then we can push the valve down so that it comes out of the other side of the head. And what we mean when we say a burnt valve is a valve that doesn't close properly will allow some combustion to take place around its lip where it should be sealing, and carbon will build up there. If a valve isn't burnt, it should be nice and smooth around the rim where it seats. That's what I'm looking at here, and actually surprisingly this valve looks pretty good, and it's certainly, when I compare it to the datum one, the one I've taken from cylinder number 4, it looks to be in good shape. So this exhaust valve is not the culprit. So I'm just going to explain a couple of things that might not be obvious as I go at the next exhaust valve for number 1 cylinder. And the first is, well, the difference between the exhaust and the intake valves. Now the exhaust valves are smaller than the intake valves, and that is a top tip, because it's easy when you flip this thing over to get disorientated and lose track of which cylinder you're working on and whether you're on the exhaust or the intake side. The next thing is, you'll notice that the tool, the near bit towards you, the black bit, that's actually got 2 heads, one for bigger valves and one for smaller valves, and I'm using one for smaller valves. And the reason for that is that older engines tended to have fewer valves in the cylinder, but they were bigger. and this tool is reversible. So if you're working on an older engine with bigger valves, then you can remove it. Now the Honda manual will tell you that before you put the tool in, you need to have a sort of a tappet protector that goes down into the hole, which stops the tool scraping the inside of that cavity. I don't know anybody who's ever used one of those tools or got one of those tools, but I mention it because it's in the Honda manual, and if you were being absolutely strict and correct with this, then you would put some form of protection tool in there. I haven't got a clue where you would buy one though, so I'll leave that to you to figure out. I did it without any kind of protection tool and had no issues at all. Well, there was nothing wrong with the second exhaust valve either. So here I am taking off the first intake valve, and as I do that, I notice immediately as I try and push the valve through to get it out from the cylinder end that there is a problem. It appears really stiff. Now the valves are a fairly tight fit inside their valve guides. In fact, if you put your finger over the end of a valve guide and pull the valve out, you should feel it sucking against the end of your finger. But they should still come out, and they should come out smoothly. And if they don't, it may mean that the valve stem itself is bent, and that is the case here. So I'm being very careful here because I don't want to scratch the inside of the valve stem. So I'm just gently working it backwards and forwards with my fingers and withdrawing it. And it's obvious as soon as I look at it that that stem is bent, and that's been the cause of the lack of compression. And it's really obvious here when I put it on a perfectly flat surface, a piece of glass, and put a ruler next to it. Now you can see that that valve would not seal against its seat because it wouldn't seal all the way around. There'd be one bit that would always be leaving a gap. So now I take out the other inlet valve, and there are no issues at all with this one. It comes out cleanly and smoothly, and there's evidence that it's been sealing nicely against its seat. So it looks like we've got to order one new valve. That's some further evidence here. If we look at the two holes on the left hand side, they're the bigger ones, so clearly they're the inlet valves. The one nearer to you has got crud all the way around where the valve should be seating. The top one, which the light's on now, that's nice and clean. So you can see there's further evidence that the valve wasn't sealing. So now let's put the valves back in. The new one's on order and should be here soon. So I'm going to clean up the valve seats and the valves themselves. But it's worth, of course, reflecting on why did that valve bend in the first place. Now, I've had a good look at the piston, and the valve has not been in collision with the piston, and it doesn't look like it's been in collision with its opposite number on the exhaust side either. There are no witness marks on there. Another possible cause for valves bending is over-revving. It's certainly not been over-rev when I've ridden it, but who knows what's happened in the past. It's difficult to say one way or another. I have been told by a mechanic whom I respect that the early Honda CBs had rather thin valve stems for the double overhead cam models, and they were beefed up later, and so it's not uncommon for them to bend. I've got no personal experience of that, but that's what he said. So the two exhaust valves are going to go back in first. They're the same ones, no need to change them, but we do need to lap them in, and that's a process where we use a mild abrasive just to grind them against their seat, and then we have to clean all that abrasive away really carefully, and then we should have a really good seal. Now you see I've got two pots of abrasive. One is a coarse one and one is a fine one. If I put a new valve in, I'd start coarse and then go fine, but as these come from this particular engine, I'm just using the fine one. I put a little bit of the paste around the stem of the seat of the valve where it should sit, and then I just a little bit of fuel pipe, which is just the right size to go over the end of the valve stem. And then what you can do is just rub it between your fingers as though you were a Boy Scout trying to make a fire. And that is a really good way of getting some traction on it and spinning it around. Now, as soon as you do this, you will hear it scraping, and then the scraping noise will go away pretty soon. And then when you think that you're not getting any more abrasion, you need to just sort of pop it out, put a little bit more paste on, and then go again. Every now and then have a little look at it, and what you're looking for is sort of a nice shiny edge to the valve and a nice shiny bit on the seat where it goes about 1.5 mil thick, something like that, so that you're confident that it's its seating. There's no need to pull hard on this. It's all about the rotating motion creating the abrasion that gets it in there. And it's a slow oil process. You've got to be a little bit patient, but it's well worth it. You get good compression and good performance out of your engine if you do it properly. Now, when you buy the paste, which is readily available, often it will come with a little sort of bit of wood and a sucker on the end, a little bit like a child's bow and arrow thing, like a sucker arrow. And then the intention of that is that you'll put that onto the bottom of the valve, the bit that you're looking at now, and then rub it between your fingers. But I just always found it easier using a bit of rubber fuel pipe. It just seems to do a better job. Now we'll get in and clean the valve guide. I use carb cleaner spray and a pipe cleaner. And the important thing is that we want to make sure there's absolutely none of that abrasive stuff in there at all, because you can imagine what that will do with the valve going up and down thousands of times a minute if we were to leave it there. So satisfy yourself that that's all spotlessly clean before we put the valve in. Putting the valves back in is much more fiddly than taking them out, so I'm going to try and give you some top tips here to make sure that it works well every time. The first thing is to secure the head so that it doesn't wobble, because this job sometimes feels like you need three hands. Here I'm just using a cheap clamp from B&Q. Other DIY stores are available, just to hold everything steady. Now the valve is already in there, so I'm going to put the springs in. The tightest bit of the spring, where it's coiled more tightly, goes towards the engine, and the small spring goes inside the big one. And then we put the retainer cap over the top. Next we'll put our tool into position, the far end over the base of the valve, the near end over the valve stem, and when everything's lined up we'll press it down so that we can press the spring. And now that should leave a nice little gap where we can put the collets in. Here I'm putting a little bit of moly grease over the inside of the valve keepers, the collets. And the reason I'm doing that is because it will just help them stick in the right place before I release the tension. Now I'm using a pair of tweezers because that seems to be the best thing to position them carefully. And while you're putting it in there, you can make a little bit more space just by manipulating the tool slightly. It's locked on, it's not going to slip off, so it's perfectly permissible to sort of move it from side to side. Also, if when you put the collet in there you think that there isn't enough room for it to go in as far as it needs to, then you can do what I'm doing here, reach back and just tighten up the tool a little bit to compress the spring a little bit further, and then that will allow you to get it in where you need it. Once both semicircular collets are in position, you can take hold of the tool and release the tension. It can come off in a bit of a rush, so make sure you do it straight. We don't want to scratch that tube, that everything's in. And then we can take a look. Now in this particular case, when we look at it and go in close, we can see that the collets aren't quite flush with the retainer cap. They're not really seated safely in the way we want them to be, but there's no need to take them out again. What we'll do now is we'll just take a socket, put it over the top and give it a couple of sharp taps, and then we'll see that everything will move nicely into position and the valve is firmly seated and retained by the collets. And now I'll repeat the process with all the other valves. I won't show you all of them, but this is the new inlet valve going in at 4 times speed with some crappy music to keep you company. of the head now, nothing complicated about this. Just make sure that we pull the cam chain through the hole, we don't drop it down into the crankcase, ease it down over all of the studs, and then give it a little tap so that it sits down evenly. Then it's on with the nuts, being very careful with the ones in the middle that we don't drop them into the crankcase. Now this is the order in which we're going to tighten the nuts up, and I'm going to do them to half torque first, so we need them at 38 Newton meters. So I'll do them to 19 or 20 to start with, nice and quickly, following the pattern prescribed on the sheet, and then up to full torque following the pattern. Jobs are good. Obviously this was speeded up footage, I was a bit more careful than this, and as always when using a torque wrench on components that are really important, make sure your torque wrench has been calibrated, and even if it has been calibrated as you're doing things up, if it feels too tight, just stop and pause and have a think. It's cheaper than stripping a thread. Back on with the two cam chain housing bolts. Then replace the oil line.
The oil bolts have each got a hole in them that the oil goes through the banjo bolt. The one with the bigger hole should be at the top, the one with the smaller hole should be at the bottom.
Back on now with the buckets and the shims to where they came from, that's why we numbered them. And as each one goes in, I press down hard with two thumbs and you should be able to move it down against the spring. It's tough, but you shouldn't feel any resistance or scraping as you do that. Right, we're going to take the next bit a bit slowly because this is the bit that everyone seems to choke over or shed tears on. It's fitting the exhaust cam. First thing, we're going to put some moly grease on the bearings for the camshafts. Now, this is all lubricated by oil when things are working, but right at the very start, it needs a bit of moly grease just to help it out. Moly grease is good in situations where the temperatures are high and there's lots of friction. Then I'm going to get a socket over this end of the timing and just turn until the 1.4 T mark is aligned with the datum as we did before, because when we put the exhaust cam on, everything needs to line up. Now we'll take the exhaust cam sprocket, which of course has two sprockets bonded together, and we'll put the chains over it. So you've got one loose chain that's going to go all the way over to the inlet cam, and then you've got the other one, which you can see in my left hand closest to the camera, and that's come up from the crankshaft. So just flop those over the teeth, doesn't really matter where it goes at the moment, just as long as you've got chains over both sprockets. And then we will feed the camshaft through and sit it down onto its bearings. There's only one right way to put it through. As it comes through, you'll see that the end coming towards the camera here has got sort of a horizontal slot on it. It's not very horizontal at the moment, but it will be in a minute. That's only on one end, and that's the way it needs to go in. And when we put this down, we want the lobes, so the pointy bit of the cams, pointing in towards the spark plugs. Now we're going to put the A and E camshaft holders in. That's the two on the outside. It's very straightforward this. Each one has got its letter stamped on it. The corresponding letter is also stamped on the head itself, and there's also an arrow pointing forward in the direction that the bike will go. So you would have to try really hard to stuff this up. Having said that, someone who stripped this engine down previously did stuff it up, and they transposed two of the cam holders. I'm putting them back exactly in the same way because we know the engine was working before. Now at this stage we're just going to tighten them down a little bit. So tighten them down until you can feel the camshaft pressing against the valve springs, but we certainly don't want it down so far that it closes the gap between the head and the camshaft holder itself. Now, one of the reasons why people find this difficult, I think, is because the wording in the manual is not particularly helpful. Perhaps it was when it was translated from Japanese to English, if that was even a thing. So let's just start. What are we trying to achieve? When the camshaft and the sprocket are in and everything's tightened down, all the cam holders are down, these two punch marks, which you can see highlighted here from the manual, need to be horizontal with respect to the top of the engine casing, so the same distance above that little lip that you can see there. Now, the issue is that when you put everything together and tighten it down, it just moves a little bit because the valve springs push up against the cam lobes in the middle and they turn it. But all you're trying to do is get everything lined up. Now the manual talks about adjusting the position of the sprocket so that those punch marks line up, and you can't adjust the position of the sprocket. The sprocket is attached to the camshaft, so they are together, there is only one place where you can screw them together, and there'll be not even a millionth of a degree of movement once they're together. What you can do is take that chain and move it 1 or 2 teeth left or right to make sure it's correct when it's tightened down. So that's the aim. Sprocket marks, the punch marks on the sprocket rather, aligned with the top of the case, the 1.4 T mark aligned with its datum, and everything tightened down. So let's look at how we actually achieve that. And it's not as difficult as you might think. I'm sorry if my bonce gets in the way here, but I do have an enormous heat. So first job is I've put the camshaft through the sprocket. It's pretty much sitting in the little shape where it sits inside the centre of the sprocket, can't go anywhere else, so that the 2 bolts can be put through and everything lined up. And now I will position it over the chain so that those 2 punch marks on the sprocket look like they're roughly parallel to the top. And then once that's done, I'm going to gently start to tighten it down a little bit. Now install the D and the tacho camshaft holders, but don't tighten them all the way down yet. The rotor bolts need thread lock. You don't want those little fellas dancing around the middle of the engine when it starts to move. You'll see that I've put a large rag or an old tea towel into the void that goes down into the crankcase, and that's so that if I drop the bolt, it'll only go onto that little bit of toweling and I'll be able to pick it up. You've got 2 sprocket bolts to put in. Just do the first one at the moment, finger tight. Now we'll rotate the engine forward 180 degrees, and that will bring the other sprocket bolt into view. Once we can see that, we'll put the second bolt in and we will torque it up. Then we'll rotate the engine forward again so that we get to the original bolt where the sprockets were lined up, and we'll torque that one. And then once we've done that, the sprocket is firmly attached to that camshaft. It's not going to move. We're not going to take the bolts out again. Now with everything is lined as best we can do it, so the 1.4 T mark is on the datum underneath the timing cover there, and you've got the 2 sprocket punch marks aligned with the top. Then tighten down the camshaft holders. Don't torque them up yet, but just tighten them down so that there's no gap, and then we'll recheck everything. Now when you recheck everything, what you will find 9 times out of 10 is that the sprocket, as we're looking at it, has moved clockwise slightly, and that's because on the number 2 cylinder the valves will press against the cam lobes. So the 2 punch marks here will have sort of rotated right a little bit. Now to correct that, what we'll do is we'll mark on the edge of the sprocket and on the chain how we need to move the sprocket. In this case, 1 tooth to the left, in order that when we tighten it down next time, that rotation won't leave us misaligned. So we need to know that this tooth here is going to align under this gap in the chain here. So we mark it up. Now we loosen the cam holders, turn the sprocket so it goes onto the next tooth, and tighten everything down again. And when we check it this time, everything should be nicely aligned. If not, just repeat. To the intake cam next, and this is much more straightforward because we didn't remove the sprocket, we kept everything whole. So we'll place it in, get the chain over in roughly the right place where we can see when we tighten it down, if it rotates clockwise just a tiny bit, all the dots will be lined up. We'll put the 2 outside cam holders now, the F and the L. I've just highlighted where the F and the arrow mark will be on here, same position on each of the cam holders. So just like we did with the exhaust cam, we'll tighten down the F and the L just a little bit. And we're going to put in the G and the K, the next 2 ones from the outside in. And then we'll start to tighten everything down in a crisscross fashion so that we don't put undue pressure on any one single bolt. And I'm just going to make the point here that any valve that you have taken out and then lapped back in again, even if it's the same valve, you'll probably have changed the valve clearance and you'll need to check that the shim is still correct. And obviously for the new valve that will need changing too. And with everything tightened down, and before we actually torque it, we'll check that we've got the 1.4 T mark against the datum. And then up here we'll look at our timing marks, which are a bit difficult to see here on the sprockets, but I'm pointing them out with this screwdriver, and they are absolutely level with the top of the head. Another thing you could look at, just give yourself a little bit of reassurance, is if you look at the end of the camshafts, you've got these horizontal slots here, and they should be pretty much as horizontal as they can be. And now we'll rebuild the head in exactly the opposite order in which we disassembled it, and I won't bore you with this too much, so I'll just run it at double speed, play a little bit of music, but everything is shown for completeness. So that's the job done on this engine. I'm not going to show replacing the cam cover because that's in another video, but I will link to that in the description in case you need help with that. And also putting the engine back in the bike and rebuilding it in other videos, again, I will link them. But what I will show here is the bike working and test riding. And after balancing the cars, she runs beautifully. Thanks ever so much for watching. Always welcome the comments. I'll change the video if I've done anything wrong or there's a better way to do it. Ride safely. See you next time.